What does a good marketer and a psychic have in common? They can both predict the future. Our next speaker, Albert Thompson, Managing Director of Digital at Walton Isaacson, is the epitome of a great marketer because he's always a step ahead, figuring out what tomorrow looks like and making a plan around it. He carries an ethos of strategic innovator and has always had a solid understanding of how technology continues to transform marketing and disrupt conventional consumer engagement models. In this next session on the future of community, he'll talk about what's happening today that is shaping our online relationships tomorrow. Due to an influx of user-generated content and an explosion of overall content, brands are now rethinking the value of community. I am always so thrilled to work with him because his passion and knowledge are hard to ignore. So thank you for agreeing to do this. And now I'll pass it over to you.
Well, Christine, thank you for that great introduction. And thank you, obviously, for the opportunity to participate in the Meltwater Voices initiative. So obviously, what I'm going to take you through is the audience through is this notion of the future community and really what's sort of driving the impact. I know there's a couple of the tenets I will touch on will be content, commerce, and comments. But essentially what I want to get the audience sort of grounded in is really this sort of strategic pivot that I think we need to acknowledge when we start to think about the future of community and what it means, what it's going to entail. So without further ado, we'll get into the presentation. So I think one of the first things we start to look at is the notion of community being the flagship store. And look, most major retailers have some sort of physical footprint, real estate that they are highly coveted. You know, you always hear about the flagship store in New York, the flagship store in Paris. You'll see from the example here, we have the flagship Louis Vuitton store. I think it would be a marvel for anyone to enjoy. But the idea is that, you know, the most vulnerable identity is a 24-hour one for any particular enterprise. And obviously that is whatever sits on a digital footprint. And when you start to think about the notion of the nature in which there are no degrees of separation between digital platforms, the ability to engage in online social communities or a centralized community that is managed by the brand, you can understand the notion of needing to treat it as the flagship store. Look, it's the always on enterprise. It has the ability to aggregate more consumers than a given store, whatever, at a given point in time. Let's be clear, stores have closing hours. So when you start to think about that, the notion of community in the modern era, you really have to think about it like it's the flagship store, that it is omnipresent. It can pull in engagement, activation from all channels. It acts as it could be a centralized hub to communicate, to share ideas, to, yes, listen to customers vent. And that's a huge point we're going to get into, but I think that's the first notion. It's not a supportive element to retail operations. Think about community as sitting at the core of the retail operation. So the first thing we talk about is really the voice of the consumer. I mean, the consumer is the only one who's guaranteed to win. I say that all the time. And they fire brands when they choose your competitors. I mean, that's just how consumer mindshare moves. And that's probably no more fleeting in this era, just because of all the options we have as a group of consumers. And then the notion of consumerism is running so rampant. We're going to get into some of the other things driving that. But I think when you start to think about the brand and its viability, I mean, much of the brand and its identity rests in the consumer's mind, how they see the products, how they talk about them, how they identify them, how they align with them, how they advocate for them. So the notion of harnessing the voice of the consumer is just key. It's essentially it, especially when you start looking at product innovations, product adaptations, when you start looking at product improvements, and the same thing applies to services. You can imagine the need to harness the voice of the consumer is so paramount, and to do it in real time. I have nothing against brand studies, but a lot of the times those studies are done in a look back window, meaning they were done months ago. By the time the stuff is edited and reported out, you're 2 quarters removed from when that person or persons were contacted or engaged with or surveyed or some sort of ethnographic study was done. So you can imagine the need for real-time harnessing the voice of the consumer. And that's a huge piece. And that is very indicative of what a flagship store should look like, really centralizing that consumer voice. I think the next point is really this merger of physical and digital. So we've heard this term phygital. It's not the best, but it does the job essentially. But this notion that the worlds are converging, that retailers, brands are looking at seamless ways of bringing technology into the retail footprint to help accentuate the experience, remove points of friction in the experience. So these worlds are starting to collide, in which they're showing up in each other's spaces, if you want to say. And I think COVID taught brands about how to get innovative when physical landscape isn't accessible. Store closings, limited run hours, appointment only. So how do we bring technology like augmented reality or virtual reality into the realm of bridging the gap between what you can experience physically or based upon the fact that you just aren't at the proximity of those physical stores, or you're just not based on health risk traveling to those stores. So I think that that merger of physical and digital is really where community can sit at the core, because community can start to beta test those aspects to the degree they work, they fail, or what should be necessary. Like, what is the consumer ask that perhaps you're not addressing, that you can start to orient around and bring that as part of your overall value chain. I think the second thing to look at is, look, we've all are making this change, and this is the notion from going shopping to always shopping. I think it always used to be a thing like, oh, I'm going shopping today, I'm going shopping this weekend. Let's be clear, in a world where we're getting pinged with SMS promotions, email promotions, whether time sales, flash sales, we are always shopping now. And when you start to think about that, community and the notion of an online community has the best shot at really harnessing that notion of always on shopping, because it is a continuous sort of, again, centralized hub where those marketing messages, opportunity, promotional ops can constantly be seeded, tested, and learned against. And I think when you start to look at that, is no one shopping at any one physical retail store always, but we're digitally kind of always shopping, whether that means we make a digital transaction or we move to physical retail. So those are the things to start to orient around, those three big points as to why community should be the flagship store, that voice of the consumer become ever so loud, the merger of physical and digital and technology, moving into physical spaces to augment the physical experience, and then this notion of always shopping. The next thing I want to show you is kind of, let's get into each of the three and why they matter. And this is a funny comic here, the voice of the consumer. And I think it's amazing that we as marketers are trying to crack the code around intent for a consumer now, when the decision-making model is long and windy and convoluted and complex. For some products, it may take days, weeks, some it takes months to years. Yet we're throwing around terms of deterministic and probabilistic, because at the end of the day, we're trying to understand intent in the moment. So this comic really kind of underscores the conundrum where exists a consumer on one side of saying, hey, it takes me time to break this down. And brands, agencies, tech stacks on the other end saying, yeah, but I need to understand that now in terms of your intent to buy. And I'd like to really have your path to purchase laid out ahead of time. Thank you. So the decision-making model isn't just some programmatic algorithm. Yes, and I think programmatic has kind of created a degree of laziness in the thinking. But the idea is that you don't just plug it into a machine and boom, get the answer. The fact that you actually have to listen to the customer. You have to understand what they are saying, why they are saying that, and start mapping the pathway of the purchase and journey based upon what they are telling you, not what just an ad tech platform says it can uncover and discover, and then boom, you're off to the races. So I think what is often absent is just the sheer listening to a consumer. And again, this really gets you regrounded in the voice of the consumer mattering so much, because of the disconnect between what we were trying to solve and answer in real time and what just actually takes the consumer a lot more time to get to. If you were thinking about, harnessing community for the sake of harnessing the voice of consumer and how community sits in that, you start to think about, well, what's the continuum? I think the first thing is the notion of listening, and listening for the sake of aggregating, meaning aggregating all the consumer voices. What is the consensus? What is the commonality? What are the common threads that keep reappearing? What is the solve of points of friction that continue to exist that have not been resolved yet? And starting from that, from a brand standpoint. Then when you think about underscoring the value of community, you start to think about, okay, a means of centralizing it. Because the reality is the voice of the consumer exists in all the marketplaces for which your product or service is present. So if you're selling it CVS, then it's 5,000 marketplaces. You're selling at Whole Foods, then it equals the footprint of the distribution of all the Whole Foods you're in. So in particular, if you're in a business in a big box retail environment, you would think about the notion of you can't synthesize all the consumer feedback at every store where the product's being sold. Every time there's a return or a question to a salesperson or representative on the floor, or every time someone's engaged in the dialogue from a DIY standpoint of proper product usage. But community, an online community, has a better chance at sort of harnessing all those voices. And then obviously when you move it through the centralization of the voice consumer, synthesize them. And the synthesization is really for optimization, like how we're going to improve our product experience, how we're going to improve the brand experience, how we're going to improve the retail experience. To what degree do we get into digital retailing in our mantra? To what degree do we improve the point of sale experience, the upsell, the cross sell experience? So the synthesizing of the voice of the consumer really is about how we're going to optimize things in our marketing mix and our repertoire across our entire value chain based upon what we now understand and are able to punch through in a manner where everything is kind of in a central repository. So this is why the notion of community really is key for really honing in on the power of the voice of the consumer will essentially wield you as a particular business. So moving beyond that, let's get into a little bit more detail around this notion of the physical and digital worlds converging. Again, consumers themselves are phygital. Again, don't love the term, but look, consumers like myself, we exist in both realms, the physical realm, the digital realm. So we participate in both marketplaces, both forms of commerce. And look, sometimes we do it in the semblance of the same day. Sometimes we have different behaviors through the week in terms of we do our physical retail shopping on the weekend, we have disposable time, and we do our online commerce during the week when we are essentially at work or supposed to be at work. But that notion means that we have to start to think about, well, how does community exist as the bridge? How can it be that connective tissue? So look, if consumers are in both spaces, both places, then brands, marketers, retailers have to exhibit behaviors in both worlds. And they have to understand between the physical and digital world, how the consumers meet there, how they show up there, because it has a lot to do with how brands should be present there. And the thing about, again, the value of community is offering and acting as a bridge. What is your experience, as the community may ask consumers or poll them? And then a lot of that feedback may come from a physical retort standpoint, and it'll come down to the points of friction or things not enjoyed or things that can be improved upon. The community can address that, use it as almost as a think tank in terms of how consumers move between the two worlds, and then seek ways to improve upon that. So again, that's the presence of that. I think the Amazon Go stores is a perfect example of Amazon looking at one click and click to buy behavior and saying, well, how will that translate in a physical world? When in a physical world, people want to browse, pick it up, walk out, and the transaction be automated in a fashion that I don't have to see a kiosk or see a customer service agent. Essentially just move through seamlessly, because that is how the Amazon.com world is becoming more and more efficient. The ability to browse, find, one click buy, you're gone. So you can see that the Amazon Go store very much was modeled after looking at digital behavior in a frictionless sort of world and saying, okay, we're in a retail perspective, how would that now show up? And you would also think about how other retailers will bring in the notion of augmented reality, in which they could walk into an environment, have their phone augment the layout and what's available, start to make choices, even if they decided to not buy through the physical mechanism, but still then bought through their phones. But the physical retail space is being used as a means of trialing. So we're starting to see this movement where people moving into physical retail is just to trial product, try it on, demo it, and then people will then leave and make a digital purchase. So we're also seeing that the purchase journey is now mixing up between the physical and digital world. And again, you have to start to look at what is going to be the connective tissue to track that, understand that, discover those points of friction, continue to deliver on the customer promise, and community has a viable chance of being the mechanism that really ties that together. If you were to move and look at, the bridge for digital by way of community, again, you start to look at where you want to understand the points of friction in the physical world. I mean, that's the key. The idea is to use that, to really monitor that, to observe that. And I say that the community has the ability to be the observation engine for brands, to really sort of pull in customer feedback as a feedback loop, and then also actually monitor it in the flesh. I always believe that you have to understand points of friction by literally watching the friction take place. So then what does community then do? It should ideate on how to bridge the gap in these gray areas and involve the consumer in the ideation. Just don't make the assumption that the answer to solve is what it is and what it needs to be. Make sure the consumer gets to participate so they get to shape shift the solution and hence the outcomes that you're going to provide to them that hopefully show up in the physical or digital realm. And then again, increase that value proposition and help build upon that customer promise. And again, I think when you start to look at that is you want to develop this symbiotic relationship between the business strategy of the physical and digital realm of the business, and community is what you seat at the core. So when people ask, well, how are we going to use the engine to discover this? Community. How are we going to ideate around that? We're going to go back to the community. And then what's going to be the driver of the business strategy to really make sure that we properly service the consumer's movement between the physical and digital realm? Community is what's going to do that. As we move beyond, again, this notion of bridging the gap for digital, we get into the notion of always shopping. So when you start to think about it, again, consumers have gone from going shopping to always shopping. And communities is one of the mechanisms that can really harness this societal shift. And I peg this as a societal shift because we will probably never go backwards to casually going shopping here and there, or just on the weekend, or just when we travel, because of the amount of inbound messaging, the amount of one-to-one communication that's happening from our favorite retail partners, our favorite brands, the fact that the opportunity to capitalize on a moment is really what's essentially taking place when you start to think about the fact that we are shopping in a 24-hour cycle. And that becomes a very different business dynamic when you start thinking about supply chain management, from product manufacturing to shipping to distribution to overall availability and accessibility. And that's why it's very important to acknowledge it as a societal shift, because now you're starting to think about a totally different way of brand planning, as well as going to market for marketing promotions. No longer is it just going to be the holiday season where retailers make, so much of 75, 80% of the revenue. The notion of always shopping is that curve that really starts to ramp up in November should start to flatten. And there should be other periods of time in the calendar window where the retail sales opportunities start to show peaks and valleys. So that's the reason that the always shopping is so critical to really understand, is that it could change the dynamic of revenue flow for the average brand, for the average retailer, against what has been the conventional wisdom for so many decades. When you start to think about, community in the context of always shopping, let's think about how we sort of break that down and better understand that. So UGC, or user-generated content, is going to be a key data signal. In particular, what consumers are talking about. I said in the beginning, the consumer is the only one who's guaranteed to win. So when you start to look at it, UGC is an indicator of where people's heads at, where their mind's at. So if you start to see the notion of people searching for product at off-peak hours, random parts of the day, middle of the night, looking for stuff outside of the promotional cycle. There was always a huge upswing for fashion around the debut of Fashion Week, when the new collections for fall and spring roll into retail. But if you start to see interest in around that particular product outside of that window, you start to understand that the always shopping has moved into other elements of seasonality. And I think that's what we're going to see, is a bit of a breakdown of seasonality. I mean, there will always be brands producing stuff around certain parts of the calendar year, but consumers will be in shopping modes year round. And particularly when you think about what you can find in different pockets of the country, certain styles exist year round because the climate supports that. Whereas in other parts of the region, it only shows up in key parts of the time. But with digital, obviously you can source product from as far away as Turkey, and not be so reliant on, are you shopping East Coast or West Coast of the US? I think the other thing is customer survey capture. So you're starting to see a lot of SMS post surveys being sent out to consumers, like, how was your experience? Are you enjoying your product? Can we offer you the opportunity to discount? But that real turnkey customer survey capture, I think it's going to be more integral with it. Really should be an offshoot of the community relationship, or even the community itself is going to be a key signal for really starting to gauge the willingness of the consumer type in your category, your vertical, to an always on shopping mode. I think the other thing is we're moving into this continuous improvement, in particular when you look at beauty. Beauty is not seasonal. Beauty is something that's a pursuit that's continuous. So you start to see, well, seasonality may uptick the consumption around, let's say, certain products like things that treat dry skin around changes of seasons. However, beautiful skin is a continuous, always on pursuit. So that is something that has evolutionary dynamics, and there are many categories that now support that. I think when you start to look beyond the signals, you start to think, okay, what do we do? Well, you should be doing offer and promo testing. The community should learn, well, okay, now that we have signals that consumers are looking for product outside of the normal product cycles we're used to, let's throw them some competitive offers and promos and see that we get traction. And I think the end goal of this is you want to identify new purchase patterns, identify new customer segments. You want to identify, has the consumer decision-making model now evolved? And again, community is key, a key attribute or element that can really sort of break this down and really start to understand and start to, as I say, be a key discovery engine for particular brands. So now that we've kind of moved out of the notion of this strategic pivot, this notion of the voice of the consumer, this merging of the physical and digital world, this notion of always on shopping, let's kind of get into some core tenets for community. You know, what are some of the things really sort of driving the changes in the modern era that have less to do with, let's say, just the consumer themselves? So the first thing is to look at community in the modern era. I mean, I think community was always about this cast of characters, these different consumer types, the different profiles of consumer, their different quirks, and that being so much of what the reaction was to. But now we're seeing these three things really kind of take it by storm, even more so than ever. And that would be the notion of content, the notion of commerce that seems to be so omnipresent in every touch point, in particular everything digital, and then comments, or what I would call just all things engagement related. So if we really start with this notion of content, content has become that addictive gateway drug to discovery, in particular for an always on shopping. So let's just think about that. It is the churning through content that has us on this endless pursuit and discovery of new product. You start to see a marketplace where a lot of the major publisher platforms, your Refinery 29 to the world, your Meredith publication, your Condé Nast, are all merging commerce into the content. We're going to get into the commerce piece in a minute, but they started to understand long ago that editorially writing reviews and critiquing new product would be a gateway to more impulsive buying. So that content has kind of become, again, that sort of gateway drug to the notion of discovery. So it's like the consumer is being actively trolled by way of content. I know we talk about trolling by the way of detractors on the internet, particularly socially, but the content in its own algorithm is now sort of trolling the consumer by crafting what it thinks you like based upon what you've consumed before, and product recommendations coming along with that. You're seeing a lot of integration of editorial and advertising merging together. So, you know, think about community as a way to harness this particular content engine, starting with UGC, user-generated content, and the creator community. So I think the creator community is a huge movement because they are natural content creators. So community should look at, well, how do we partner with these creators? How do we bring them into the fold? How do we get them to create stuff on behalf of our respective products and services to sort of advocate and be that first person voice to get more consumers to discover the opportunity and possibility? And that's why the content engine is so huge now, and why you see major movements by brands like BuzzFeed, starting to marry commerce because they understand the content is that catalyst. The question is, how now do we get them to impulsively buy and shop? When we start thinking about content and commerce, I don't think there's anyone more notorious at this point than TikTok. And everyone's buzzed around the notion of TikTok, maybe buy it. I would probably say there are other platforms that have had some degree of success of getting consumers to react, but I think TikTok has just coined the phrase. And a lot of it is like, look, the degrees of separation that used to exist between content and commerce are no longer. It's not like you read it, you click out, you end up at another site, then you drop in a shopping cart and end up, into the lower funnel. You're starting to see, again, from those partners I mentioned before, that the content, the commerce piece is one click away from the editorial you are consuming. So all these platforms, the big walled garden, social platforms, Google, are all rolling out all these tools to make buying more readily accessible, more impulsive, if that's even possible, than it already has been. And they're really doing it around these micro moments. I mean, Google coined the term micro moments years ago, saying the average person looks at their cell phone probably 150 times a day. I don't know, it could be double. But when you think about it, all those moments now become moments to buy. And that is why we're in an always on shopping mode, because half of the time, and I'm probably being facetious, that we are engaging with our phones, we are looking at an opportunity to buy something based upon being on a platform that is engaging us socially, or looking at SMS messages that are coming in with hourly promotions, you name it. So we're moving into a world where everyone's making us buy. It just won't be TikTok that gets the claim to fame. But the notion of the lines effectively blurring between content and commerce is why we're in this always on shopping mode. And again, when you start to think about the notion of community, much of that is going to be the key in really understanding how that movement is going to continue to manifest, and what are going to be the new platforms which such and such made me buy it really starts to emerge. Okay. So now that we've moved on, around this notion of always on, who's going to make us buy it, let's get into the idea of lookalike modeling. Lookalike modeling is nothing new, but it's been in practice for a while, but it's really been based upon lookalike to a relative consumer file. You're looking at conversion data saying, I have this customer or customers, I want more of them. But I would beg to say lookalike modeling needs to move to a higher level related to all levels of engagement, in particular the highest. People commenting, replying, reposting, clicking, viewing, and obviously purchasing is part of that. But the notion of understanding engagement and what it means is going to be key for the aspect of community, because community can't just be about existing consumers. It has to be about future consumers and the growth of consumers and the growth of the share of wallet. So I would look at the idea of all things engagement related to how the community ingests a level of intelligence. And think about when I said comments and all things engagement being part of the configuration of the voice of the consumer. And that really helping round out the community, having a certain degree of intellect as it pertains to understanding the future opportunities. So think about lookalike modeling, again, not in the conventional sense around a converted consumer profile, but starting to look at who's talking about the brands. I always say the most coveted brands are not only the ones that are bought, but are the ones that are being talked about and bought as well. So listen, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And just as a kind of a recap, those core tenets was very much about content, commerce, and all things comments related. And then some of the strategic pivots I mentioned in the beginning. So hope you found the presentation very insightful, and definitely wanted to give thanks to the Meltwater team for, once again, allowing me to participate in the Voices Initiative.
Albert, as always, it's hard to be distracted when you've got the floor. Thank you for taking the time to present at Voices. I hope that all the listeners are reminded that what happens today is shaping tomorrow.